Awesome. Good evening, brothers. My name is Dio Proto Papadakis, graduate from Appalachian State University 2017, um, Director of Graduate Engagement for the fraternity. Thank you for being with us tonight. We're going to be covering the topic of leasing property for a chapter house. And that topic will be presented tonight by two 1848 Housing Committee members, Pete Welsh, Wittenberg 74, and John Ziza, Ohio 78. Some of this, just to go over the topics we're going to cover tonight. We're going to go do some brief introductions. First and foremost, go into a quick overview of the topic itself. Discuss when does it make sense to lease. Also discuss some benefits and risks associated with leasing property. Some considerations to take when leasing. Go over some leasing terms so that everyone gets a full, clear understanding of what they mean, and then ultimately the resources that they can utilize to understand those more and get the most out of those resources. And at the end, we'll address any questions that any of the attendees might have. And brothers, feel free to use the chat box in the bottom to ask your questions, and I believe we'll be answering those at the end. So, brothers, I gave my quick introduction. I'll turn it over to our panelists for the night.
Thank you, Dio. This is Pete Welsh. We've got John Ziza as well. Both of us had our active Fiji experience in Ohio, a few years apart, and both of us have had experience in chapter house management, and now we're on the 1848 board, and are here to share some of our knowledge and experience with the fraternity through this webinar approach. This is recorded. This will be available for future use, and our goal is to have this as a resource that others can use if and when needed. What we want to accomplish here and talk about really pertains to the leasing of property by a chapter or by a house corporation that serves the chapter, and that would be distinguished from a situation where a chapter or house corporation may already own property. The chapter is dark for whatever reason, and what are some of the considerations in leasing to another fraternity or another group? That's a separate topic. That's a topic that both John and I also have experience in, but we'll cover at another time. This really pertains to, our goal is to hopefully cover a lot of questions and considerations that a chapter may have when embarking upon finding a property and a property for lease. When does it make sense to lease? The gold standard, the ultimate goal, I would imagine most brothers would agree, is to own your own chapter house and have the full ownership and control of a property that becomes a destination and part of the chapter's identity on a campus and survives for a long, long time. We have chapter houses that chapters have owned for well over 100 years. The opportunity to own a chapter house or a property doesn't exist in every case, and there just may not be property available, zoning or whatever, to acquire. There may not be resources to acquire the property yet, capital needed to make an acquisition, and where I think it's most likely often, the chapter may be a young chapter that is growing and building in a strong alumni support group, and has the goal of ultimately owning a chapter house someday, but is not there yet, is also building up the numbers and the size of the chapter needed to support and justify occupancy of a property. There are benefits of leasing a property. Number one, as a landlord and an owner, you have basic responsibilities for structural integrity, usually roof, paving, things like that, that the tenant or the chapter does not have to bear. That's takes a contingent capital responsibility away from the chapter having to worry about. That's a benefit of leasing property. The other benefits are, as I think I touched on, that the chapter may be too small, but is growing and is not at its optimal size, and may need a few years to hit its optimal size, but wants to have a place to meet and be identified with, and that's where a short-term lease comes in quite handy. So those are some of the areas where leasing is actually advantageous and is the right decision on behalf of a chapter. When you arrive at the point of actually going out and starting the search for property, clearly the very first step that needs to be taken is a financial step, is a budgeting step. I'm going to turn this over to John for a moment here to talk about that, but the understanding the financial reality both that exists presently with the chapter, what is expected or projected to exist in the near future is very important to understand before committing to and taking on the financial responsibility of property, whether leased or owned. So, John, why don't you jump in from here?
Sounds good. Dio, can you scroll up to the top of the page? You're in the middle of the budget right now. Perfect. Thank you. So the budget is structured where you have the income at the top and then expenses throughout. What I've done with this particular sample budget is I've grayed out the areas which are included in the total costs of running a chapter, but not specific to leasing a house. So what you'll see is a complete budget that you could use as an example to do your financial planning. But specifically for leasing, just focus on the areas that are not grayed out. And where we're going to start is in the bookkeeping section below the gray area. We'll come back to the income because we have to figure out what our costs are first before we can determine our income. So the kinds of things that you have to take into consideration when leasing is obviously all of the bookkeeping and tax concerns, capital improvements. Even though you're leasing, the terms of the lease may require you to make some capital improvements to the house. And so you're going to have to refer to your lease to find out what liabilities you may have regarding that. In addition, you may have responsibility for some of the safety and security elements of the house, like fire equipment and exterminators and things such as that. Some landlords include that in the lease and others do not. As well, you may or may not have cleaning expenses. Again, it comes back to the terms of the lease and what the landlord covers. Most universities require a house director or a house mother, so you'll need to include those costs in your budgeting. And you'll have insurance, and we'll go into depth about insurance costs later in the presentation, but you definitely will have insurance costs as it relates to leasing. You may or may not have a kitchen in your house, and you may choose to outsource that kitchen solution, and we'll talk more about that later. But there are a lot of costs for managing the kitchen yourself, including licenses and equipment maintenance and purchases and dishes and silverware and a cook and all the taxes and liabilities that go with having an employee on premises to provide board services to the guys living in the house. You may be required to pay for landscaping services. again, it's going to depend on the lease. And one of the things you'll definitely want is a lawyer as you go through this process. So you're going to have legal expenses. You're probably going to have an accountant, so you'll have accounting expenses as well. You may want to consider getting a line of credit because there are going to be expenses that you have there that are unanticipated. And until you build up your reserve, you may need to have funding to cover those unexpected expenses. Certainly, you're going to have taxes. If you have employees, you're going to have workers' comp and all the taxes that go with having an employee. And utilities, again, I go back to the terms of the lease. You could have cable, electric, gas, water, and sewer. It really depends on what the terms of the lease are, and you need to pay close attention to that. The other comment I'll make about the lease is you might want to consider as part of this process a couple of things. One is determining how far out you want to go with the lease, whether it's a 3-year lease or 5-year lease, and depending on what the length of the lease is, you might want to put a trial budget together for that whole time so that you can see what your costs are going out through the years. Because as a new chapter, you may start with 10 guys and you may project to be at 30 guys in the house in 2 or 3 years. And you need to budget for that and account for that. You might want to consider doing a reserve study. What a reserve study does is it helps you define what the costs associated with your operation will be over time. For instance, I would recommend that you consider developing a reserve fund that is actually off the budget. And what the rule of thumb I use is 10% of your total budget to put in the reserve on an annual basis. And the reason for the reserve fund is to fund this study that you may or may not do. So you'll need money, for instance, for your insurance deductible. Most deductibles are about $10,000 per event, and you'll need to have that cash on hand should you have an occurrence. So you'd want to have a reserve fund for that. The furniture that you have for the house has a life expectancy. And so you're going to want to plan for that obsolescence, and you're going to build a reserve for furniture. And, you know, the chapter room, the things that go into the chapter room, again, they're going to wear out, and you need to plan for their obsolescence. And like I said, you may have to use a line of credit before you build up your reserve fund, or ask the brothers for donations, do some fundraising. In addition to this budget, you may want to consider a separate fund if your desire is to own a house long term, is to put a reserve fund in to put monies against a down payment for a house, in addition to asking the graduate brothers for donations. That's kind of the budget in a nutshell.
Thanks, John. Okay, once you've gone through the budget exercise and made the determination that you have adequate resources to cover not just the rent, but all the other costs that, as John's identified here in the sample budget, what's the next step? Leasing a property is you're entitled to, or your interest in the property as a tenant is evidenced by a document called a lease. The lease is a legal document that binds both the landlord and the tenant to agreements, perform certain things and receive certain benefits, receive occupancy on behalf of the tenant, receive rent on behalf of the landlord, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a legal document, and as such, another very early step is to hopefully find a local attorney experienced in real estate contracts, ideally a Fiji, graduate brother, they're out there, and especially one that understands the local laws. Real estate contracts are typically governed by state law, so a local or local laws. So a local attorney is obviously the best choice to understand the contract and what should be in a contract. Another thing, as you with the comfort and knowledge that you have the resources to commit to a property and backed by legal representation or guidance from counsel, from an attorney, your next step is to identify the property, identify options to lease. You can engage in the services of a broker if it is, with assuming the property is large enough to make that worthwhile. If you're leasing a large single-family property, chances are the seller is not going to want to entertain covering the cost of your broker. In real estate transactions, it's typical for the seller or the landlord to cover the expenses of the tenant's representation or broker. But again, that pertains to large properties. If you go out, more likely if you go out and find properties yourself and scour the market, identify what the best option available. Certain things you need to be very careful to consider. Number one is the neighborhood that you're in. If it's a neighborhood of high-end, well-maintained homes, and you've got a property that you're going to be occupying as a fraternity house right in the middle, give serious thought to how compatible you and your use is going to be to the neighbors in the surrounding community. Having parties at houses is done. It's not, it is part of fraternity life, hopefully entirely in line with the current safety and local laws in terms of alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, gatherings are likely to happen at the house. And is that permissible? Does the current zoning allow for, or local occupancy requirements allow for occupancy above a certain limit at the property, even temporarily occupancy for a night or two? So understand what the local covenants and occupancy requirements and zoning are before you commit to a property. You can identify that or do some research with the city and just find out what the local requirements are. Ideally, the attorney that's working with you can help you in that regard. So those are to start. Those are some of the considerations, the process. We're going to roll into quickly some of the lease terms that you're going to encounter here, and there's potential for a lot of discussion on each one of these terms with specific instances. I'm going to keep it very general and broad right now, and just use these as you read a lease, things to look for and consider, and what you might need to agree upon up front before you commit to that. There's three basic types of leases: gross, modified gross, and triple net. Gross is where the landlord pays all the expenses. Triple net is where the tenant pays pretty much all the expenses. And modified gross is a hybrid of the two. Typically, tenant paying all expenses except for taxes and insurance. Modified gross is the most likely lease form you're going to see, in that the landlord wants to make sure the property taxes are paid and the insurance premiums are paid, and by having that responsibility to cover those payments himself, he's ensuring the payments get made and his property isn't in jeopardy because of lack of payment. Who signs the lease? Typically, the landlord's going to look for some financial strength from the entity that signs the lease. If the entity is a created single-purpose entity, LLC, however your attorney recommends you you recommend you formulating one, it's likely to be an entity that does not have a lot of assets. From the landlord standpoint, leasing to an entity that has little or no assets is not the optimal solution. He may not even accept the entity, and that's where a guarantee may need to come in. A guarantee would be from somebody, either an entity or more likely an individual with financial strength to guarantee the performance of the lease from the tenant standpoint. That could be parents. That could be a generous graduate. That could be one of the actors themselves, probably unlikely at this stage in their career, but that could very well be a requirement that needs to be met before the landlord would accept the chapter as the tenant. Lease term, the landlord would wants flexibility and the tenant wants flexibility. If you found the perfect property and you're comfortable that it can work for you based on chapter growth projections for the next 2, 3, 5 years, entering into a longer term gives you more security that you're going to have the premises available for more than just 1 year. Alternatively, though, the lease term, if it's a 5-year term and the chapter after the first year or two does not grow, or the chapter grows but actives do not want to live in the house, or occupancy becomes a struggle, then the inability to meet the income needed for the term of the lease becomes a problem and a risk to the chapter, in that they may not be able to fulfill their obligation for the full term. So having an ideal situation would be to have lease terms for a year at a time with fixed options to extend. Again, what's in the chapter's best interest is to have known, fixed, and identifiable options to extend, kind of what we would call fixed rent or step-up rent for future years. And how many options? Again, that would be a function of how long the chapter expects to be able to use the property based on its size and the chapter's ultimate goals of acquiring their own property. At the end of the lease term, there's what's called a holdover clause. Not something to ignore, in that at the end, that last date of the lease, the landlord expects the tenant to be out of there. If there are some straggling brothers, you could potentially be hit with a much higher rental rate called a default rate, which, if not paid, comes out of the security deposit. And so be very careful of holdover clauses. And as back to the lease term, be sure to tie in the lease term to the school year when your brothers are going to be in occupancy, after which they disappear for the summer. You don't want to be responsible for the summer unless it's a multiple year lease. The rental rate is going to be set by the market. It's a rental amount that's negotiated between the landlord and the tenant. Typically, the landlord is going to be mostly in the driver's seat in most markets, based on the desirability and tightness of attractive and appropriate real estate. And to make sure you're getting the best rate possible, there are appraisers out there that can be engaged to determine market rents and provide comparables. Aspiring business and real estate students can do that on their own by doing a market search themselves and see what else is available and what other comparable properties are being offered at. So that's that. Security deposits are going to be required. The amount of the security deposit varies all over the board. It could be up to 1 full year of rent. It could be a couple of months' rent. The important aspect to consider on security deposits is how are they returned. Pay very careful attention to the provisions for returning of the security deposits, and advice to all groups would be at the start of the lease, or when you're at the point of taking occupancy, do a mutual walkthrough with the landlord. Maybe have somebody take a video of the condition of each room and each common area, the outside, et cetera, et cetera. So there's proof of just what condition the property was in when the chapter moved in. That'll make the landlord's job of trying to get defaults covered by that security deposit that were already in place a lot more difficult. Default clauses in leases, pay also special attention to those. The obvious one is non-payment of rent, but for example, there could be a nuisance clause if the usage, if the tenant is providing nuisance, if there are police calls or neighbors complaining, et cetera, that could be a cause to terminate the lease. Misuse of the premises, excessive damage, evidence of drug use, et cetera, are all possible events of default and need to be understood carefully. Insurance is a big topic. I'll turn this over to John to cover insurance considerations.
Yeah, the first thing you need to know about insurance, it's really designed to protect the landlord. They're going to be in the first position. They're going to be the primary loss payee, and the house corporation is going to be in the second position. You'll want to review your lease to make sure that you know if you're required to carry property damage as a part of the lease, or if the landlord is covering that. But these other coverages you'll definitely need to carry. First is business personal property coverage, and that covers items like beds and furniture, chapter room equipment, and other assets that the house corporation purchases for the chapter. The second coverage you'll need to have is loss of income coverage, and that's to cover the house corporation financially in the event that some sort of loss causes the house to close and you can no longer collect income from the undergraduates. Now, these losses are only catastrophic losses and not self-inflicted losses like the chapter being booted off campus. So you need to understand that. The other coverage that you'll need to have is property legal liability, and that provides coverage for the brothers living in the house and guests visiting the house should they either damage the house or injure somebody on the premises. Our insurance company provider is Holmes Murphy, and they have offered to review any lease before you all sign them to make sure that you all fully understand what insurance coverages you need to have. And that's a free service that they provide. So you'll want to take advantage of that. Back to you, Peter.
Okay, thanks, John. Repairs, be very careful, very carefully understand who's responsible to cover repairs. If it's general, leaks or problems with toilets, general stuff, that's often the tenant's responsibility. The tenant needs to engage a plumber. If there's a major mainline or lateral drain stoppage, that's more likely to be a landlord responsibility. But read that section carefully and have your attorney negotiate the maximum amount of repair assistance from the landlord. Anything that's needs to be repaired due to excessive, or misuse, obviously is going to be the responsibility of the tenant. Consider carefully the electrical capacity of the house, the condition of the HVAC, that's heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and is it operating? Is it functional? Is it at the right capacity for the occupancy level of the house, et cetera, especially with respect to electrical systems? If it's an older property and has basic wiring, or is wiring for a single family use, or a use that was maybe 20, 30 years, appropriate 20 or 30 years ago, that may need to be enhanced and needs to be discussed. The current usage for electricity right now from, microwaves, refrigerators, computers, printers, shredders, whatever, requires a much higher electrical capacity than typically houses built 30, 40, 50 years ago provide. Also, the condition and the capability of internet services. I'll go back to John on that. John has some specialty in that.
You need to understand, as a part of your lease, if internet services are included. And as you think about land usage, you need to think about it in terms of devices and not number of people living in the house. When you think about students coming on campus today, they typically show up with a phone, an iPad, a computer, and maybe even a gaming computer. They're going to be streaming videos, they're going to be streaming music, they're going to be playing games online. So their use of the internet is much more significant than even a typical business. So you want to make sure that you have capacity to service that amount of usage. And how you need to think about it is you need to think about maximum usage. So think about those days when maybe there are chapter meetings and you have the entire chapter in the house, and how many people that might be, and how many devices might be connected, and what kinds of things they may be doing. You might want to consider having a guest internet service and an internal internet service, so the guest users don't use up the bandwidth of the internal network that the brothers use. It's fairly easily done through a firewall. And if you can, you want to have a dedicated service that's a fiber optic service. That's going to give you the best performance, and it's going to be the most easily upgradable. And as you negotiate these services, a couple things to keep in mind is you want to negotiate the ability to upgrade service levels. And you also, if you can get away with it, you want to try to negotiate a 9-month lease if you can. Some providers will let you lease land services for 9 months, knowing that in most cases the house is closed for the summer. So by all means, if you can get that sort of lease, definitely go for it. Back to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you. Then just a few other minor other topics, not minor. Safety and security responsibilities. The property is of the size where the doorways are locked and accessible through electronic entry pads or electronically operated locks. Then whose responsibility is that? It's for reprogramming, for repairs. It'll be a very high used component of the property, and it's also subject to misuse by, especially if it's a code, having brothers pass codes on to girlfriends and other friends that don't belong there or don't reside there, and that negates really the benefit of having security. But from the perspective of the lease, who's responsible for maintaining the security components of the property? A minor topic, but if it happens, it could become a big one. And that is, in the case of a gross lease, or even where the landlord pays the property taxes but passes them through to the tenant, that's certainly a common scenario on commercial property. If the landlord sells the building during the term of the lease, which he has the perfect right to do, it's likely that the local assessment authority, the city or the county or the municipality, will increase the property taxes based on the sale price, the purchase price of the property. If that's passed through to the tenant could be, despite best efforts in budgeting, the tenant could be responsible for a much higher property tax through nothing they did and nothing they could have anticipated. So it's helpful to look at that, and if that is property taxes are required to be covered by the tenant, be sure to have a clause in there that prevents the increase of property taxes passed through to the tenant due to a sale. Something to know. So there are certainly other topics to consider in a lease. I think we've covered most of the basic ones, most of the ones to give some thought to up front, and with the right experienced counsel, he or she will probably come up with other considerations. The lease document is a document almost always provided by the landlord, not by the tenant. So you will be looking at a document that has been written by the landlord and will be generally geared towards what's in the landlord's best interest. So consequently, you need to be aware of, look at it from your own best interest, and that's where your counsel has experience in representing you and protecting your interests. So with that, I think we've talked enough about the terms. We've got references and resources here. John, do you want to cover a little bit about the food service resource we have with Upper Crust and the insurance resource we have?
Sure.
Yeah.
So if you're leasing a house, you have a couple different options in terms of providing food service. You can do it yourself, manage the kitchen yourself, and pay your cook and manage the food and those sorts of things. Or you could use our preferred supplier, who is Upper Crust, and they're a turnkey solution. They come in, they manage the entire kitchen, they put menus together, they can put any plan together that your organization desires. They do a really nice job. Their food is great. Their service is great. I would say, based on my experience, that you probably need about 40 members using their services for it to be financially viable. And that doesn't mean that you have to have 40 brothers. You can recruit people from other houses, or there are other people who may be interested in the meal plan, and actually you can generate some revenue with that. But they provide a really nice service. Shana Smith is our contact there. And even if you don't plan to use their service, I would recommend that you have them come in and provide you with an estimate, because what they do as part of their estimating process is they give you a complete analysis of the kitchen, the condition, what's needed, what's broken, so that you can go back to your landlord and share with them what things you want to have repaired before you consider signing the lease. So definitely use them.
Great, thank you. And in general, 1848 exists to support the needs of the chapters, and the chapters from a housing standpoint. That's why we were created a few years ago, primarily as a resource. right now, with questions or concerns or needing discussion of or needing help in any way pertaining to chapter house issues, contact the president of the 1848 Housing Group, Steve Bacher. His email, steve@Catchfire Marketing, is listed under resources. We're creating a general domain email for 1848, but right now, contacting Steve will get the best and the quickest response. I think that ends the presentation part, and we can roll into any questions that might be out there and do our best to answer them. And Dio, you want to let us know if there's any questions that have come up?
Sure. There's actually a few, brothers. First and foremost, what's a typical security deposit or damage deposit amount charged by the housing corporation to the chapter as a tenant?
So what is a typical security deposit amount? Is that the question?
Yes, correct. Charged by a housing corporation to a chapter as a tenant.
Oh, charged by a housing corporation to a chapter. So the housing corporation could either own the property or be the tenant and have signed a lease for property, and then in turn is leasing to the chapter. I guess either way. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it does vary. It certainly could be as low as a month's rent, but that's highly unlikely. That's what you'd expect. Maybe, first and last month's rent from renting out an apartment building. I would say, and John, share your experience with this too. I would say, as from a property owner's and a landlord standpoint, you'd want as big a security deposit as possible, maybe 6 months or half a year, realizing or recognizing that your option to release a property that is designed for student housing exists once or twice a year. It doesn't exist on a regular basis. In other words, if you've lost halfway through the year, the chapter disappears, the tenant disappears, the landlord has lost both expected revenue and the ability to replace that revenue until the start of the next school year. So I would be prepared for at least half a year's rental amount as a security deposit. It could be as high as that. John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it comes down to whether you lease to individuals living into the house or if you lease to the chapter as a house corporation. In the example where you lease to the house as a house corporation, so you make the undergraduate members responsible for collecting rents and just paying you a monthly check for rent. My experience is we've collected deposits of $10,000 to $20,000 a year. And I can also tell you it's not uncommon that they don't get that money back. A lot of things happen in a chapter house throughout the year. And depending on how big the house is, how many guys you have in the house, the cost can mount. If you're leasing to individuals, I think the first and last month amount is probably appropriate. But I would also consider a separate amount for the chapter at large, because you're going to have brothers using the house who don't live in the house. And so that's kind of when parlor fees come in, and it could be part of the parlor fees. But you'll want a separate amount to cover for lack of a better term, the general areas of the house.
Right. Okay. Any other questions?
Sure. Are security deposits or damage deposits charged for member tenants as well as the chapter as tenants? And I'm not sure, Daniel, if you want to clarify. I'm not sure, brothers, whether that is asking are individual members who live in the house charged as well as members who are not. or does the chapter get charged as a whole as well as individual member tenants?
Well, my first reaction to that question would be who is on lease. Is it an entity that is owned by the chapter? Is it the chapter itself? If so, the entire chapter is on lease. If the tenant is a group of individuals, maybe 10, 15 brothers living in the house as individuals, it would collectively be just the individuals. And then it would behoove the individuals to get some assurances or coverage by those other chapter brothers not using the house, not living in the house, and not responsible for the security deposit in the event of damage where the security deposit has to be used. They'll need to be careful to protect themselves. But it really gets back to who is the entity that is signing the lease. That is the entity, whether it's in a group of individuals or an entity as defined by the chapter or whatnot, that is responsible for the security deposit.
And to further that point, if you're leasing to individuals and not to the chapter, you can capture those funds through parlor fees.
Yeah, and parlor fees serve both the purpose of, as John alluded to, the covering, if needed, the amount of security deposit to cover unexpected repairs and damage. It also should help to cover normal operating and occupancy expenses, both chapter and property, because the brothers having the benefit of using the property and should be responsible for some portion of the upkeep of the property.
Brothers, and lastly, does Upper Crust Foodservice provide service in all states?
I believe so. Now, they may not be in all campuses, but they are willing to, they would love for you to be the first person on campus. And they provide the first person on campus with the best rates. I can share that from experience. So their process is they bring a chef onto campus and they build meals through the chef for multiple houses, and they share their resources across multiple houses as they grow contracts. So they're always eager to get on a campus that they may not be on. So yes, I would say based on that, they would provide services at least in the contiguous 48.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too. They identify themselves as nationwide. They may not be on every campus, as John says, but they'd like to be, and they'd like to be in states they're not in. So consider them somebody that would be interested regardless of where you are. I had one last question here. What if we want to do some renovations or changes to the space, i.e. build a chapter room? That's a real possibility if it's going to be, if the property is being leased as a chapter house and some part of it wants to be dedicated as use for just a chapter room. That will require some temporary walls maybe, or maybe something even more significant than that. Altering the physical demise of the interior of a property almost always requires the landlord's approval. So that is a discussion item up front. The landlord, automatically will know should know who he's leasing to and what the expected use is. And if it's a fraternity or some members of a fraternity and who want to have meetings in the property, there may well need to be a space created within the property, if there's enough space to do that, that serves that purpose. The way to negotiate that with a landlord is to agree to accept the responsibility of turning the property back to where it was at the start of occupancy at the end of the term of the lease before the chapter room was created or before any other alterations or modifications were made. If that might require a higher security deposit too, so the landlord has security to ensure that return to original condition can be met at the end of the lease.
Go ahead.
No, that's it. Go ahead.
If I could add a couple other considerations or resources available to you all. If you're considering leasing a property on campus, I would talk to the university and ask them if they're aware of any sororities or fraternities that are planning on closing. Those could be ideal locations for lease opportunities. As well, I would get the names of the other house corporation presidents, both sororities and fraternities, particularly those who lease on campus currently, to find out what their experience has been and who they've worked with to lease properties, just to get that firsthand knowledge of what leasing in your locale, what that experience is like.
Great.
Very good.
Okay,
point,
brothers. Dio, I'll turn it back to you. I think we've reached the end of this webinar, and I'll let you close this out here, Dio.
Absolutely. Thank you, brothers. Pete and John, thank you for presenting tonight, and thank you, brothers, for joining us. If you do have any questions, I will turn it back real quick to the resource page again, just so you all have those contacts. And if you all do ever need anything, feel free to call headquarters as well. We'll always at least direct you, point you in the right direction. Brothers, thank you all again for taking the time tonight, for joining us, and I hope that you all will join us again in 2 months when we'll be hosting our April webinar. Thank you, brothers, and have a great rest of your evening.
Good night, brother.